Hello and welcome again to I Helped Make That. And today, on our special episode, we're going to do something a little different. Because the thing is, I'm joined by not only my guest, Alex Gradet, but by a co-host of mine with Mr. Mike Pisacano from the Cinemarketing podcast. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me on here, and I'm excited to do the interview portion of this, and then also do the marketing stuff. So, if you don't know about my show, Cinemarketing, what me and my co-hosts do is that we look at movies that were heavily marketed, or marketing played a big role in the movie's reputation. We discuss how the marketing influenced how the movie is perceived, and all of the commercials and trailers and promotional stuff that was made for it.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike. So, yes, what we're going to be basically doing is an interview portion with Mr. Alex Gradet. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Hi, great to be here. I appreciate you having me. I do hate to start on a contrarian note. It's Gradet, but quite all right. We'll go back and loop those.
Yeah, you know what? I really need to learn how to pronounce my guests' names. I did the same thing with Katie
quite
Lee.
all right. It's been happening my whole life. It's great.
All right. Well, so if you don't know who Alex is, he is currently working at Disney Channel. And what do you do, Alex?
I'm a senior writer-producer for Disney-branded television. So that's Disney Channel, Disney Junior, Disney XD, and a little bit of Disney Plus, some crossover with Nat Geo. We've reorganized internally a bunch, especially in these last couple of years. So basically, a marketing project gets put on my plate, and then I write and produce it.
Thank you so much, Alex. But before he did that, he was a production assistant for the story and editorial department of the hit animated movie Ice Age. And today we'll be talking about that. Yes, I'm following up an episode of Fatal Attraction with an episode on Ice Age. Why? Because guess what, everyone? This is no longer I Helped Make That. This is the Krakowski cast. That's right. I am now just doing a podcast on movies that had Jane Krakowski in them. And if you want to create your own podcast focused on the filmography of one certain actor, try Anchor today. Because Anchor is the easiest platform to use. All you have to do is sign up for a free account. Then you got everything going. And then you can put on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all those platforms. So everyone, if you want to try your own podcast, try Anchor today. But no, everyone, we're not actually changing it to the Krakowski cast. Though, if someone wants to actually make that podcast, try Anchor. Wouldn't you agree, Mike?
Yeah, and if you want to talk about wild tonal shifts in episode releases, I just followed up doing an episode on the Jackass trilogy with The Hunchback of Notre Dame, so I understand that as well.
All right, so let us begin with you, Alex. So,
Sure.
Alex, tell me, for our listeners, what is a story and editorial production assistant?
Well, just two caveats right at the start. First and foremost, this was 20 years ago, so my memory's good, but it's also a little bit patchy. So that's one caveat. The second is, and this is something to kind of keep in mind when you're discussing Ice Age, is that it's weird to think about now, but feature CGI animation was very new at that time. At the time I started working for Blue Sky Studios, which was in May of 1999, there had only been about, my math is probably wrong here, but there'd only been about like 4 high-profile, fully computer-generated animated features at that point, which is wild to think about now because that comes out, 4 come out in a fiscal quarter now. But at the time, we're basically talking Toy Story, Bugs Life, Ants, and I said 4 because
I think Toy Story 2 was probably out at that time also.
Came out about 6 months later, but yes. So the point is, we're in this very early ecosystem where there's Pixar, there's DreamWorks, and like DreamWorks was really just playing catch up at that point, and Pixar had this sense of market dominance while only releasing like one movie every couple of years because that was the amount of bandwidth that it took. So as far as what a story and editorial production assistant does was all being sort of made up on the spot, bringing some institutional knowledge from traditional animation for what those roles should entail. But generally speaking, it was like, we're making this up as we go. So story and editorial, the reason I wound up working on those two was I was initially hired, I think I was the second full-time employee to work on Ice Age. Like literally we were a full-time crew too, because at that point Blue Sky was still doing a lot of commercial work. They were doing a lot of effect shots for other features.
Like Fight Club?
That was actually in production when I started. And I remember because at that time, Blue Sky's offices were in this little building in Harrison, New York, and I was living in the city, so I was commuting by Metro North every day. And I was like, they keep talking about this movie Fight Club that they're working on. It's something about a penguin and fighting, and I don't really know anything else. I'm going to get this book out of the library. And so I read it over the course of a few days on the train and was immediately just like, could not separate myself from the Fight Club. The crew that was working on those effects, I'm like, hey, what you guys working on? Tell me about this. What's going on? I became kind of a really like, I was an early insufferable adopter on that. So it was me and one of the producers just working and a couple of modeling artists and the screenwriters who had yet to become a permanent fixture at Blue Sky, although they would in fairly short order. And we were just feeling out what the movie was going to be, what the characters were going to look like, what the story beats were going to be. It was all very blank page when I started. There had been earlier drafts of the script, so it's not like they were starting totally from scratch, but there was almost nothing at the time I started. And so I was a general PA for that stuff, which involved filing and collating and archiving concept art and just all sorts of stuff that I had no experience doing, did a very bad job of doing at first. And also it was my first paying gig in the entertainment industry and the thing I hadn't learned yet. And if I could go back in time and teach myself one thing was, if you don't know, ask, because at the time I was very much like, I have to prove to these people that I'm the right person for the job. And the way to do that is just assume you know what you're doing. Like I was just pure fake it till you make it. And at 22, everyone knows you don't know what you're doing. There's an expectation you don't know what you're doing. And so my advice to people starting out in the entertainment industry right now, if you don't know what you're doing, don't behave like you know what you're doing. Then, probably after about 6 months on the job, they started to bulk up the crew for Ice Age. And as other smaller jobs around the studio were wrapping up, more and more artists and TDs and everybody were being pulled over to work full-time on Ice Age because it became the primary project for the studio. And at that point, they determined the need, well, we really have to break this out into much more organized departments. So new PAs were brought in and assigned to different departments. Now, based on my interests, which were primarily writing, and because I'd been in there as they were continuing to develop the story, they said, well, a good fit for you will be to work with the story department. And then as editorial comes online, because story to editorial is kind of a direct pipeline, it made sense to have one person covering both departments. And then as time went on and the story department began wrapping it up, then my focus shifted purely to editorial later on in things. So once that happened, I was assisting storyboard artists, which was everything from getting them the pencils they needed, the supplies they needed, the furniture they needed, to maintaining the storyboard archive, the digital archive of storyboards, which definitely appeals to the more meticulous side of my nature, the numbering and labeling of everything, scanning everything to get it into the pipeline from story to editorial so that editorial could start building the animatic. All of that was really kind of fascinating to me, even at a time in my life when I didn't know anything about the materials I was handling or the people I was working with.
Great. Thank you so much.
I have a question, actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
I want to know, so wasn't Ice Age originally conceived as a 2D animation film when it was over at the Fox Animation Studio? I wanted to know what was the translation over from conceiving it as a 2D movie to a CG movie, if you were involved at that at all.
Well, by the time I got hired by Blue Sky, it was fully their project to develop. So 2D was no longer a consideration. What you're describing certainly sounds familiar, but was not a part of the process that I was there for. So I can definitely speculate a whole lot, but I do know that the course of action had been one of the key elements in awarding Ice Age, which had been on Fox's development slate. In awarding that to Blue Sky was that earlier in the year that I started with them, they won the Oscar for Best Animated Short for Bunny. And that gave Blue Sky some clout. And Fox was looking to develop a studio to be a pretty direct competitor to Pixar. Because again, Pixar was running the table at that point. So Fox saw the opportunity to grow an animation studio that had been focused on passion project shorts and commercial work and music video work and VFX shots into a full 3D animation studio. And Ice Age, I suppose, felt like the project to do that with.
So I actually heard that at one point Fox was considering like selling it to Disney or just canceling production. Were you involved with that?
I don't recall that specifically, but I do know, I suppose it doesn't particularly matter now because it's 20 years ago and Blue Sky has unfortunately been shuttered.
Yeah.
But the relationship between Blue Sky and Fox was it was a tricky one, because Blue Sky when I started there was that sort of what wound up being the tail end of having a very startup energy to it. And it was the late 90s, and the idea of running an animation studio like a tech startup made all the sense in the world, because that was what was in the air, this idea of pursuing a passion and having a work environment that reflects that passion, whether or not it is the most fiscally viable or whatever. And I'm not casting judgment when I say that. I'm saying that it's like everyone wanted to work in those kinds of environments because that was the model that was being set for, the almost decade at that point. So there was still a lot of startup energy to it when I started there, but my being a dedicated employee for Ice Age meant that I really had sort of a front row seat for watching the transition from this startup energy studio into being a subsidiary of 20th Century Fox. So there was a cultural shift that came with that, which a lot of the Blue Sky, to that point, lifers, which would have maybe, the longest running employees there had been there only for about 10 or 12 years at that point. There was some resentment to that cultural shift, because the thing that felt very special and a place that had felt very special was suddenly changing into this place with a lot of corporate oversight to it. I'm not casting judgment on either workflow, because I think either one will get the job done, and I leave that up to the studio chief to determine. So I think that shift from self-determined studio to corporate subsidiary was a difficult cultural shift for a lot of people involved. And I know that wasn't just from the perspective of like the labor level. I know management had a hard time with that too, because they'd been independent for so long. So I think there was some contention between Blue Sky's management and Fox's management. And if that wound up coming to a point of almost canceling the project or reassigning it or selling it off to Disney, like I said, I don't recall that specifically, but it certainly sounds in character for what to me as low man on the totem pole looked like that relationship between the studios.
And with that being said, there were also a lot of script changes I read about, like Scrat was only supposed to be in the beginning, and Diego the Tiger was supposed to die at the end. Did that affect your job at all?
Yes, all of that. I can confirm all of that. Scrat was never in the script. The script literally began with the southward migration that you see after the introductory sequence with the Scrat. And Scrat grew out of a kind of love of the game. Like, there were a lot of classic animation heads at Blue Sky that were sort of indifferent to classic story beats that the movie follows pretty diligently, and wanted to get some juice into it, some animation into it. And so they invented the Scrat, who was originally, he was this saber-toothed squirrel, was all we knew, was a creature that had never existed biologically or physically, but it was someone they knew they could have fun with. And this sort of Looney Tunes unfinished chase of this acorn became, first of all, the cold open of the movie. And then when that became either just before or just after that became the teaser trailer, and they realized there was an opportunity to thread Scrat sometimes organically, sometimes less so throughout the whole movie. So you get these little pops of Scrat's story as you go, up to and including the literal finale of the movie. A lot of that, I think, was happening sort of late in things. And I say I think because I don't actually remember, but on your advice, Kevin, I rewatched the movie this week, and it was so funny to me, like how, because of the workflow of animation, because it's developed over such a long period of time, I have seen Ice Age in part or in total probably more than any other movie I've ever seen in my life. And I'm a guy who rewatches movies like nobody's business. So there were scenes that it was like, oh my God, I haven't seen this in 15, 20 years. And I know this scene like the back of my hand because I saw it when it was first storyboarded. I saw it when it was the animatic. I would watch it in animation dailies. And then it was funny because then there would be a scene like a scrap moment sort of halfway downstream where I was like, wait, I'm not as familiar with this one. And it's like, right, because they decided fairly late in production, we haven't seen Scrat in a while. What can we do with Scrat right here? I could be mischaracterizing how late in the process that came, but I do know that a lot of the Scrat scenes were very, what would on a live action shoot be, what would constitute reshoots, basically.
Yeah, I wanted to say, because in the trailers, a lot of the times, and in the posters, they would group all four of the characters together. So even as a kid, I thought that it was the four characters as a
Me
group
too.
going off on an adventure together. And there's one scene in the movie where they interact with Scrat. So I remember when I saw the movie as a kid, I was surprised. I was like, oh, wow, he's just kind of like his own random side character thing. Like, he's not part of the main group. I even thought he was going to talk. Like, that's
Exactly.
how.
Yeah, well, that's the illusion of marketing right there. And we can get into my value judgments of the movie and how that fed into marketing like that later. But yeah, so the prevalence of Scrat was a fairly late addition. Diego was meant to die, which I think you watch the movie now, it's pretty clear in the execution of his death scene, and that his resurrection is never really explained away.
Even as a 9-year-old, I had a problem with that.
Okay, see, I'm happy to hear that. Happy's the wrong word. Look, with the movie's made its money already. I can't, so it's not, we're not tearing anything down, but it's like what you've just said right there proves a point that I remember being very on the fence about. And I'm not trying to make out like 20 years in retrospect, I was definitely the smartest person in the room the whole time, because I certainly wasn't. There were like 3 moments across 2.5 years that I can remember been the guy to make a good point in the room. But my point was, I feel like there was a lot of hand waving where like a studio mandate came down, like, you know what? It's too dark having Diego die like this. His sacrifice is valuable, but tonally does not belong in a movie for kids. He needs to come back. And then there was not a ton of discussion, but like, how do we bring him back? But a lot of just sort of leaning on movie logic of like, oh, it was, just a flesh wound or whatever, and just hand waving that away, because with this feeling that it's a movie for kids, they're not going to be bothered by that. But you've just proven that kids do track things like that. They are confused by things like that. They are bothered by things like that. And one of the recurring motifs that was, look, nothing in the entertainment industry, nothing in the world matters less than the frustration of a 22, 23-year-old production assistant. Literally, that has like a stolen NFT has more value than the frustration of a 23-year-old PA who thinks they're not doing this movie to his satisfaction. And I know that now. It doesn't change how frustrated I was at the time to be like, what if we didn't assume the worst of kids? What if we didn't think kids aren't paying attention, or they will just go with this? And it felt like we spent a lot of time underestimating how kids would react to stuff, or what was sort of critically important to the success of making a good movie for kids. When you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because you are talking about the transformation of a studio that had been dedicated to some pretty groundbreaking technological advancements within the field. And I would never take that away from them, because I think they have made some great contributions that really moved the ball down the field in terms of what the medium can do. But it was dedicated to things like dancing cockroaches in Joe's apartment, or the penguin from Fight Club, or digitally mapping the late Nancy Marchand's face onto a body double for that one episode of The Sopranos. These are things that are technical considerations and that were pretty pinpoint of the studio. I mean, some pretty amazing work, some of which in CG means a lot, some of which is aged incredibly well, because CG by and large does not. So then ask a technically focused studio to transform into a center for kid-focused storytelling. That's not going to be an automatic process. And that's why I think a lot of the people who were hired subsequent to me, when we were really crewing up, and John Carnahan, who had worked on The Lion King, was hired as an editor, Yvette Kaplan, who was the head of story and who was one of the most wonderful people I've ever worked for. So hiring people like that was essential, but I feel like there was still a lot of high-level hand-waving of, it doesn't have to add up. And it's like, well, that's categorically false. And to me, that's a legit cheat when you're making something meant for children, because then that lets you off the hook of having to do the best that you can do.
I remember when I was a kid and going back to trailers and like altering your perception of the movie. In the trailer, they show the scene when Diego comes back and Sid's like, "Oh, you're back. You're okay. I can kiss you." And then when I saw the movie as a kid and there's that death scene, I knew, I was like, well, there's that scene in the trailer where he comes back, so I know he's not really going to die. And then I wanted to ask you, was there any actual like testing, or was it shown as, did you finish a scene of Diego's death and then like screen it for kids, and then or is this just some sort of perception that you're like, well, we can't do this?
I do believe, and again, this is anecdotal and drawing on 20-year-old memory, but I do believe it was tested, and it tested poorly, that Diego died, which makes sense because tonally the movie is in a lot of places at once. You will have a scene where the central joke is Sid steps in poop, and then 15 minutes later, you've got, not even 15 minutes later, like literally 2 story beats later, you have these very menacing saber-toothed tigers chasing a human woman off a waterfall to her death. And a lot of that comes from the redevelopment of the story from where the early script drafts had been into what it wound up being was literally done a sequence at a time, which I think is fine and a totally valid way to build a movie. But it meant that you're locked into these essential story trajectories that once you change this thing over here to be lighthearted and comedic, you have to consider the balance of how this thing over here is going to play. And who are you setting this expectation with? Like, literally, there are like 4 poop jokes within the first 10 minutes of this movie, it feels like. Or at least one poop joke that goes on for quite a bit early in this movie. And then literally, because it's what the story demands, you turn to saber-toothed tigers talking about eating a human baby, which is a through line of this whole movie. And it's, so the problem was, you can have your poop joke scenes, but then you have to ask yourself, are we still gonna keep the thesis of this movie being one of our hero trio is a double agent who is leading the other 2 to their deaths as well as the death of this human baby, and make that for kids?
Yeah, I will say that while thinking about it, it did kind of feel like an interesting mix between trying to be like Disney darkness, Pixar sentimentality, and DreamWorks edginess. I don't know if it's necessarily bad, but it's at least an interesting mix, and I could definitely see that it was a mix that came from studio notes. So you were saying, Mike?
Oh, I was gonna say, because if you're talking about like the crossover of like the trends of the time of like the different studios, different styles and identities. I remember as a kid when I was watching this movie, and I think what it seems like we've been like, kind of nitpicking like a lot of the flaws of the movie, like storytelling. And I enjoy this movie. I loved it as a kid, and I still like the movie now, so I don't want to seem like we're being too negative on it. But I remember as a kid, the Manny and Sid relation, I was like, this is just Shrek and Donkey. They're just doing Shrek and Donkey again.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up, and I actually want to address points that both of you have just made, which, Kevin, you just mentioned DreamWorks edginess. But it's important to note that as they were developing Ice Age, I said we, and I'm like, no, as they were developing Ice Age and I was bringing them their coffee and sharpening their pencils, DreamWorks edginess didn't exist yet. But to me, and I worked on this from the spring of 1999, when the movie was in early development and had not been formally greenlit by Fox yet, to February of 2002, which is when East Coast Ops kind of wrapped up on this, and the whole project was locked and delivered for final stages of post-production out here in LA. So the two things I remember most acutely both happened in 2001, which were that spring, Shrek came out. And I worked, I had been working on Ice Age for 2 years at that point, and me and my girlfriend at the time go and see Shrek. And I spent the whole movie just collapsing into my sweatshirt because I'm just like, I've spent 2 years working on something original that is now a knockoff. And I'm going to tell a catty story where I got the best zinger in, which I swear to God, I'm not trying to make me sound cool, but was sort of, to me, kind of endemic of what the Blue Sky approach was. And I swear to God, none of this is supposed to sound like a hatchet job. And I have some very sweet stories I want to share about working on Ice Age and working at Blue Sky, and I promise I'll get to them. But the day after Shrek came out and absolutely just ate everything at the box office, the first meeting of the day was the Sweatbox meeting, the Animation Dailies review. And there was a chill in the room because this is May of 2001 and we have a locked release date of March 2002. And essentially, while obviously having a lot of differences involved, Shrek shared a lot of core tenets, particularly in those early scenes of how Shrek and Donkey come together. And Shrek is this grumbly hero who wants to be left alone, and Donkey is this joke machine sidekick who won't leave Shrek alone, and that becomes this grudging friendship. And it's like, that is literally the arc of Manny and Sid for the whole first movie. And there was this chill in the room, and I remember one of the animation directors, we were looking for the silver lining. And in fairness, as an animated feature, from a technical perspective, Shrek is fine for its time, but was not necessarily groundbreaking. Where it was groundbreaking was grafting that kind of storytelling and that kind of edginess into an animated feature. And that's the stuff, that and All-Star is what everybody remembers about the first Shrek. You go back and look at it now, like, visually not the most appealing movie you ever saw. And that improved over time. The same could be said about Ice Age. The same could practically be said about Toy Story also. I mean, if you look at Toy Story, which is an almost 30-year-old movie at this point, and look at Lightyear, which is coming out in a couple of months, and it's like there's an absolute disconnect there. But so I walk into Animation Dailies and I read the vibe immediately, and it is chilly in there. And one of the animation directors says, looking for the silver lining, is like, well, our layouts blow theirs out of the water. And while I agree with that, I couldn't help what came out of my mouth next, which was, and as we all know, kids love layouts. And I regret having said that. May have impacted why I was not invited back to work on subsequent Blue Sky features. But regardless of which, it's like, for all of the tonal mismatches that we've discussed Ice Age having, Shrek plowed right through that, like found a way to tie some pretty far-flung things together. I think because the stakes are never that high, they're never as visceral as saber-toothed tigers are going to eat a baby. Like, the stakes are never that high in Shrek. So they found a tonal balance that had kind of eluded some of the storytellers on Ice Age. And Shrek was reaping the benefits of that. That was the right hook in the spring of 2001. And then 6 months later, in the fall of 2001, obviously a very different climate. If anyone in the class would like to tell me what might have changed in American life between May and November, not just to do with that, but we were rounding the bend on finishing up production and editorial on Ice Age. I believe that, by November Blue Sky had announced that unfortunately they were going to have to be layoffs after Ice Age wrapped production because they didn't have a green light yet on their next feature, because Fox was waiting to see how Ice Age performed before determining if the movie that then became Robots was going to happen. And then when Ice Age performed well, they greenlit Robots, they brought a bunch of staff back, and at that point Blue Sky was off and running. But it's November 2001. Ice Age is almost locked, and with the storytelling already having been, well, we're in too deep, we got to live with this, even though Shrek has beaten us to the punch on that. At least Ice Age can boast that the texture and fur of its animals is like nothing you've ever seen before.
I know where you're going with this.
And then Monsters Inc. came out.
Yeah.
And I remember watching the scene when Sully has been banished to the Himalayas, and again, you've got another story, semi-stoic, big, bulky main character, little wisecracking sidekick, and their job is to return a baby to where it comes from. So, like, whatever of our storytelling Shrek had not eaten, Monsters Inc. came along and said, are you going to finish that? And then I'm watching the scene where Sully's banished to the Himalayas, and it's all wind and snow and fur. And it was like, and I saw Monsters Inc. I remember this now. I saw it in the East Village with a bunch of once and former Blue Sky employees, and we all watched that scene of Pixar wind rippling Pixar snow through Pixar fur, and we all just, our hearts just fucking sank. And again, none of this is a reflection on the final product of Ice Age. None of it is a reflection on the final performance of Ice Age. Ice Age, which has gone on to be a very successful franchise right up until the shuttering of Blue Sky, which had nothing to do with the success of their projects and really just more to do with internal politics with, you know, various corporate mergers. But it was like the production arc of an animated feature was so long at that point in the history of the medium. And it just became so galling to watch 3 different studios arrive at wanting to tell similar stories, and our studio being third one out of the gate was not a great feeling. But the fact that Ice Age went on to be released and to be successful, the kind of success that it was, and to reach an audience and to mean a lot to you guys, which by the way is really lovely to hear, because considering there's a bit of an age difference between us, which we don't have to discuss too much. But I have, for all the time I spent working on Ice Age, I have never really had conversations with its intended target demo. So this is really refreshing. And it means a whole lot to me. I do want to put that on the pile too.
I think as a kid, my tolerance for the big grumpy guy and this low sidekick, I'm like, Ice Age, I was fine with that. And Shrek and Monsters Inc. I think at Brother Bear is when I drew the line. I'm like, all right, can we stop doing this? Like, even as a 8-year-old, I was like, all right, I've seen this so many times already.
Well, and it's not like Shrek invented the form.
No.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. It
Yeah.
didn't really invent the formula.
Yeah, because
It
you
invent
can I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Oh no, it's okay.
yeah,
I was about to say that even Shrek could be drawn from Aladdin and Genie, and
Yeah, I mean it's
or you know what? To go back even further, Fred and Barney.
yeah, I mean it's and I think I feel like The Honeymooners was definitely discussed in the development of Ice Age. And, you know, that's classic storytelling. I remember the first time I ever saw the Western The Searchers was in doing research for Ice Age, because that was, again, that's about 3 begrudging friends returning a baby. So a lot of that was deliberate. We knew that we were developing a story. I say we a lot. And I had literally 1 story contribution in my entire that made it into the finished product, which I'll get to in a moment. So I'm not trying to take credit for the work of other people, but like with any movie, it was always a deliberate notion of Ice Age's core genome was made up of other movies. Movies are always made up of other movies. And it was going to be a little bit of this and about, you know, pulling this element of this John Wayne movie into the animated medium, this element of The Honeymooners into an animated medium, and which I think was done fairly soundly when it comes to Ice Age. There's a lot of good bones, a lot of good architecture that definitely made it through. So while I've been fairly critical of the movie this whole time. I mean, a lot of that is still vestigial, valueless 23-year-old discontentment with a project that I was very low man on. And but again, the fact that it came together and it meant a lot to a lot of people. And don't think that for all my grumbling while I was working on it, that the minute it got nominated for an Oscar, don't think I didn't dine out on that for about 5-6 years, I want to say.
Yeah, I do just want to say that, even though we have our problems with the movie, none of us really think it's a bad movie. When it's just kind of it's just kind of not a great one. It's a good movie. It's
Yeah.
a perfectly good movie with some fun sequences and likable characters. It's like, for instance, if, say, The Simpsons is Disney, Family Guy is Ice Age. It's
Yeah.
like the Family Guy
Wait.
to Simpsons Disney.
But going off of that, of comparing Family Guy to Ice Age, this might be going a little bit into the marketing a little later on, and I think I don't know, I don't think you probably would have been involved with this, but the Fox promos of Sid introducing, and this was for Ice Age 2, where they did like these commercial interstitials with Sid, where he would introduce the shows on the Fox lineup. And it's been very highly memed now, the clip of Sid introducing Family Guy, and he says, it seems today that all you see is violence in movies and sex on TV. And it's like, oh my God, Sid the Sloth said sex on TV.
It seems today that all you see is violence in movies and sex on TV.
And it's like,
when you boil that down, that makes sense. Let's not forget, though, that a central scene of the movie involves Sid trying to initiate a three-way in a hot tub.
Him, where we're going, he can't follow if you catch my innuendo. What do you say the three of us jump in the gene pool and see what happens? Yeah.
And that was, to my recollection, one of the earliest scenes we developed, which is where star of the podcast Jane Krakowski comes into it. Lori Bagley, who had been part of the cast of, I think, Veronica's Closet at that point, the sitcom that was running around that time. The two of them are the voices of the female sloths. That was I seem to remember that as being a very early in development sequence. And I don't like the ethos of, well, you could never make that today. Mm-hmm. But I was watching that scene the other night, and I was like, I remember even at the time thinking, I'm like, I'm sorry, who is this for? and I felt the same way, by the way, in the Minions movie, where there's a shot of a minion with two yellow fire hydrants in a hot tub. And again, it's like, I totally understand the something for the kids, something for the grown-ups ethos of kids' movies. That makes sense. And of course, Shrek absolutely codified the early version of that, which is the smutty stuff is going to go right over the kids' heads and they're just going to laugh at the gingerbread man. And that's fine. But it's like, you need a hot tub scene, whether it's in Ice Age or Minions, is a single entendre. Like, there is no double. There's no level the kid is going to get that on, except the grown-ups will get it on more of a level. So you're just left with basically like what I didn't want when I took my then 3-year-old to see Minions is for him to be like, what was going on in that hot tub scene? Because I don't know what the explanation is for that. But
yeah, I will also say there's another double entendre, which I'm not sure, it's not necessarily that it didn't age well. It's just that 20 years later, kid actually probably could understand the joke more than a kid in 2002 would, which is when Diego meets Manny and Sid for the first time and he says,
I see. Can't have one of your own, so you want to adopt.
That felt like something that counted as an adult joke in 2002, but with more, LGBT representation now in the media isn't so much nowadays.
Yeah, it not only is it a gay joke, but it also came from a place of gay panic jokes in a way. Like, he's essentially using that as a dig on Sid and Manny's masculinity which is like the thing you got to remember. The thing I found myself remembering when I rewatched this the other night, like Ice Age belongs to literally a different era of movie making. It feels like just yesterday for some of us, but like the thing to keep in mind, and this was like the starkest way I could verbalize it, was when this movie came out, there had never been a Spider-Man movie. Like that's how far back we are in terms of the changes. Obviously Spider-Man came out a few months later and things began to change very rapidly after that, but it's like in terms of what the thinking was, this comes from a completely different era. Like there is the two hot tub sloths who are basically played as, not for nothing, and I don't love using this word, but they are basically played as skanks. Like that's not okay. And they are also they have the most dialogue of any female characters in the entire movie. And looking at it through a modern lens, things about it do start to fall apart, like how all of the saber-toothed tigers have Latino names, yet are not voiced by Latino actors. But there's
including
that
Dennis
scare
Leary.
factor. What's that?
I said including Dennis Leary.
Including Dennis Leary. But it's like that scare factor of the exotic foreignness of their names. While you've got Sid and Manny over here who are just, good old chucklehead names. Things like that. I'm happy to say we have a better grasp, a somewhat better grasp on the optics of things like that now, which is really great. I'm not making excuses for it, except to say it was a completely different time. It was a less considerate time and a less inclusive time, but it was a different time.
One thing I want to ask, actually, going back to the female slots, is wasn't there also a deleted story thread? And I was a kid, I watched on the DVD a bunch, that there was a more prominent female sloth character who had a crush on Sid and was following him throughout the whole movie. And in that hot tub scene, instead of the rhinos coming after him, it was her. And then that's when he has Diego pretend to eat him so that way he can get away from her.
Yes. Thank you for reminding me of that. It's funny. I had completely no memory of that. And then the minute you said it, it all just came right back. That is absolutely accurate. I can't recall the character's name. She was sort of a gloss on the bit in Who Framed Roger Rabbit when Eddie Valiant goes to Toontown and sees the silhouette of Jessica Rabbit up in the high rise, and he goes up and I can't remember the character's name. She actually has a character, but the idea is she's gross and amorous and, just sort of that classic cartoon trope, right? Except as a character spread out across this entire story. And she was voiced by Kristen Johnston from Third Rock from the Sun, who, side note, is one of the best Shakespearean actors I've ever seen, and was cast in this movie as the ugly sloth who won't leave Sid alone. Yes, her scenes were cut entirely. Because I think for as unconnected to inclusivity as the movie was, I think that one, I don't even know if it made it to testing before execs were like, you have the most prominent female character in the movie and her one job is to just be ugly and chase the main dude.
I just had one question that I wanted to ask you that actually I know you could actually say about the marketing that I was just curious by. So I ran into a tweet of yours where you said that your side of Ice Age's production team was disappointed they didn't use Radiohead's Idiotech in the marketing. Is that true?
Well, okay, disappointed is a strong way of putting it, because everybody had sort of a healthy cynicism about the project. And when you stare at something and just one thing for 3 years, you're going to develop a love-hate relationship with it. I have a very strong love-hate relationship with this movie that I think has come out. There is a lot that I love about this movie, and I'm going to cram that into the next 6 minutes before I have to go, I promise you. But time came that by this point, the company had moved to its then headquarters in White Plains, which was a much larger office because we were a much larger crew. And I feel like this must have been sometime in early to mid 2001 where they called together an all hands meeting in the big meeting room. And they said, we've got it. We're going to show you the first theatrical trailer for Ice Age. And now this was the actual like sizzle spot trailer, not the Scrat cold open teaser trailer. So this was the first time we were seeing the material recontextualized for enticing an audience in. First time we're really seeing real marketing of it. No shade on the teaser trailer, but that was just a whole cloth lift of a sequence from the movie. And this was exciting because you've got animators and TDs and riggers and story artists all around the room, and they get to find out if the shots that they worked on are going to make it into the trailer. And that's an exciting vibe. And we were all super psyched that Immigrant Song made it into the trailer a full 15 years before Thor Ragnarok could claim it. We were less psyched when I remember at least a couple of us, we heard the bass riff come in from Under Pressure, and we're like, all right, that's a solid trailer jam. And then wait, we know why this is in a trailer for Ice Age. And then we heard it, stop, collaborate, and listen. And we're like, oh, right. Of course, it's not going to be Under Pressure. It's going to be Ice Ice Baby. And then I remember via whatever the 2001 equivalent of Slack was. I don't even remember how we did internal communication, but whatever was the don't put it in an email, but just I am about it. I remember a thread where someone was like, literally, Idiotech, which was I think about a 6-month-old song at that point, was like literally says Ice Age coming, Ice Age coming. Like this is a natural fit. And I don't think they were being serious about it, and certainly tonally not the right vibe for a trailer for your kid-targeted animated feature. But I was delighted when 15, 20 years later, someone on Twitter made a joke about Radiohead predicting the movie Ice Age coming out. Like the joke that was being made was that if you study the lyrics of Idiotech, you can see that they're clearly predicting the release of the movie Ice Age. And yeah, I jumped into that thread. I'm like, I can confirm to you that at least one person I worked with had made that suggestion for the trailer at some point. So it was unofficially official. It never had a shot at making it into the trailer, but there was definitely some chatter among the cool kids, among the indie kids, like, how come we're not marketing it this way?
Thank you, Alex. Just so now quickly,
Yeah,
because I know you only have 3 minutes. What are the sweet stories you wanted us to share?
Yeah, because I wanted to ask, he said he had one story contribution. I'm like, we can't let him leave without saying what made it into the movie that he made.
Okay, so initially, there's some real bifurcation to the movie, and I feel like I can sense that even now, that when you get to the back half of the movie, it picks up a whole lot of momentum, and you have a couple of sequences in a row that I think are legitimately great. Like you've got the ice flume sequence in the ice, you've got this sort of ice museum sequence where they see like there's a UFO frozen in there. Sid takes his place on like an evolutionary chart, and the sequence directors who worked on that were, I think, the same ones who had developed some of the Scrat sequences. So you've got these great nonverbal, just straight animation sequences that really get to the cartoon of it all. And I think they work great. And then you've got the ice flume sequence, which again, not a lot of dialogue, just a lot of great gag work, which has some wonderful momentum to it. You get into the ice bridge over the lava, like solid action sequence. And this comes bam, bam, bam. And the movie really gains a head of steam as it heads toward the back half. The first half of the movie is much more episodic. You've got Sid and the Rhinos. You've got the fight with the dodo birds. You've got all of this stuff where there was this sense that you've got this episodic first half and this momentous second half, and we didn't quite know how do you get from one to the other. And there had been additional episodic sequences, one of which was going to be like a pro wrestling type vibe, which got nixed because it was just too similar to the dodo beat that had just happened. And so we're in the story conference and everybody is, making suggestions. And I raised my hand and I was like, and I think at that point, the Disney Tarzan was fairly recent. And I was thinking about the Son of Man sequence in that, where Tarzan is educated in how to be less feral, more human. And I was like, folks, we have a road picture here where we never really see them on the road. Like we never really get the sense of the journey because we keep having these episodic beats where they're essentially stopping to travel to deal with whoever, these confrontational idiots are in their path. And that beat happens a few times. And I was like, what if we do a road montage here where we just get some good animated gags in there, but you get the sense of the passage of time. They come out of it with a stronger bond. And so then that was at a point in the company's transition from standalone studio to corporate entity where like a PA could just get a suggestion in. But it was also at a point where a PA could voice a suggestion and then have it not be taken seriously. And so I voiced that suggestion and it bounced around a little bit. And this was my first professional experience with something that has happened a lot since then. After my idea was considered, then nixed, then more ideas were bounced around. One of the producers said, so yeah, what if we do a road montage here? And I'm proud of that contribution. I think it's a good sequence because I think that's where you fold in the hero trio meets Scrat. You know, you keep story stakes in there of Diego and where he's at in his mission. Is he working for the other Sabretooths? Is he bonding with his friends? You see a little bit of both. You get just some fun gags in there, which again, I think Ice Age is at its strongest when it stops talking and just lets the animators be animators. So I'm very proud to this day that I can point at that and say, look, it's not a groundbreaking story idea. I was just the first person to say it out loud in that room on that day. We probably would have arrived at that conclusion independently of that. But I'm proud to say that I started the ball rolling on that, and there it is in the finished movie. When I started working there, I shared a sort of double wide cubicle with another production assistant. Her name was Sarah Rice, and Sarah also lived in the city, so we commuted together for a couple of years and we became buds. And she lived in Tribeca with a couple of roommates. And one of her roommates had actually previously worked at Blue Sky, had sat at her desk and had left to go work for a movie and theatrical producer in the city as his assistant and development person and script reader. And when that predecessor had left, recommended Sarah to replace her. So Sarah started like 3 weeks before I did. We wind up sharing this cubicle, and Sarah would tell me stories about this roommate of hers. Sarah would tell this roommate stories about me. And I only mention it because that roommate and predecessor, who I almost but not quite worked with, she and I have been married for 15 years now. And so for all of my young, I am being underutilized, they're not listening to me, why should they? I'm a PA resentment from having worked there from 21 to 25. Had I not worked there, I would not have met my wife, my son, who I took to the last Ice Age movie. And that is a surreal experience when you take a kid to a movie made by a studio without whom this kid wouldn't exist. Like, that's just an unrepeatable experience. I will never have that experience again. Plus, watching a later Ice Age movie and one that I had nothing to do with, I had the opportunity to be delighted by it and to feel like I was seeing some old friends and to be proud of the literal old friends that I would see in the credits or who I see in Pixar movie credits now because they've wound up at different studios. While the day-to-day of it was a grind, because the day-to-day of anywhere is a grind, I got to work with some amazing people. I got to work with people whom I am friends with to this day, largely in the social media sphere, but also we've wound up working at different parts of Disney. So we have, you know, these professional ties still. We have the personal ties because it's the oldest analogy in the book to say that making a movie is like going to war. And I think an animated movie in particular, where the workflow covers years instead of weeks or months, it's a real cementing experience. So while I might have mixed emotions about the finished product, I can't begrudge the experience at all. And I'm still using things that I learned on that experience 20 years ago in my life today. So when it came to the Oscars, would I rather have been a story PA on Spirited Away? Who the hell would? But at the same time, it was a wonderful experience. It literally changed my life. It was my first professional job in the only industry I've ever wanted to work in, and the only industry to this day that I have worked in. So I think having mixed emotions about it is going to be kind of a natural reaction, because any 3-year period in your life, you're going to have mixed emotions about. And if I can get in a plug, I also co-host a podcast with my friend Laura Hertzfeld. It's called This Year's Rent, and it's where we discuss the musical Rent 20 years after its initial debut on Broadway. And one of the things I realized over the course of that is that while I used to find Rent to be a really cringy show, it does have elements of cringe to it, but what really I was responding to was how cringe I found myself to be at the time when I was under its spell. So when I say I didn't like working for, working on Ice Age was blah, blah, blah. Working for Blue Sky was blah, blah, blah. No, being me from 22 to 25 was blah, blah, blah. And as a consequence, while, like you said, I do have these nitpicks, it was a great experience and an unrepeatable one so far in my life.
Well, thank you, Alex, for coming on to the interviewing portion of the show, and have a great day, Alex.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Mike. It's been a real pleasure. And let's do this again sometime.
Yeah, definitely. I'll talk to you later, Alex.
You too. Take care. Bye.
You too. Bye. Thanks for listening, everyone. Join me and Mike for part 2, where we will be doing a Cinemarketing mini-sode on Ice Age. We'll see you then.
Let me hear both sides, let me